the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Monday, March 16th, 2015. Actress Daniele Watts joins us in studio to discuss the concept of white missing girl syndrome, how media and law enforcement responses to a kidnapped child vary widely based on the color of the child's skin. Watts' new short film, Muted, takes the issue head on. And we'll speak with journalist Eileen Truax about her new book, Dreamers, an immigrant generation's fight for the American dream. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
The ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Obama administration requesting disclosure of the criteria used for the so-called kill list for unmanned drone targets. Additionally, the country's largest civil liberties organization wants to know exactly who the U.S. has killed and how many have been killed. It's estimated that U.S. drone strikes in various countries like Pakistan and Yemen have killed between 1,100 and 4,700 people. But so far, there has been no public information about what criteria are used to determine who the U.S. singles out for these extrajudicial assassinations, and what legal basis is used to justify the killings. The ACLU is concerned that there are U.S. citizens among those killed. Well, Rahul, the Obama administration has boasted it's the most transparent administration in U.S. history, so the ACLU should just expect to receive all the information it's asking for, right?
Well, first, I just want to emphasize that those varied numbers of 1,100 to 4,700 are the CIA drone strike program. There are also drone strikes carried out by the military, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we know even less about the numbers there. And we certainly, in all of these cases, we do not know how many combatants and how many civilians are being killed. With regard to the documentation, I don't expect the Obama administration to turn over anything without a court decision. I think that, you know, it's hard to speculate, but I think that some kind of statement about the criteria for how they put people on the kill list is something they might well make available if they are forced to. Details about who has been killed, who has been put on the lists, I imagine even with a court order, they're absolutely not going to reveal any of that information except maybe in a handful of cases they have determined are just not important to them.
Well, we'll certainly follow this story. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the conflict in Syria, in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, despite report after report of the latest death counts and brutal means of mass killing by mostly government forces. The international community has done little to hold the Bashar al-Assad regime accountable. In an interview on CBS, which aired on Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said for the first time that the U.S. would have to negotiate with the Syrian regime to staunch the civilian casualties. Specifically, he said everybody agrees there is no military solution. There's only a political solution. To get the Assad regime to negotiate, we're going to have to make it clear to him that there is a determination by everybody to seek that political outcome and change his calculation about negotiating. That's underway right now. In the past, U.S. officials had made clear that Mr. Assad would have to step down as part of an end to the conflict. A State Department spokesperson said later that Washington would never directly negotiate with Assad and that it would have to be through an intermediary. Well, Rahul, does this represent a softening of U.S. policy on the Syrian regime or a hardening?
You know, it all hangs on a sort of very fine interpretation of the kind of scanty words that Kerry gave to it. But my guess is, based on what he said and based on the very quick reaction, even from within the State Department, is that it represents a restatement of the already existing position. I mean, what the United States still doesn't seem to appear to have come to terms with is the fact that, well, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, over 215,000 people are dead, probably over 300,000. It's hard to know what those estimates are, but it's very clear the war continues, the devastation continues, and the Assad regime is not going anywhere. So a political solution, a negotiated political solution to have any sort of meaning in the real world is one in which they are not going to try to push Assad to step down. There's no reason for him to step down. A negotiated solution would involve probably a division of Syria into different spheres of influence and certain kinds of commitments from each side not to engage in reprisals and military acts and some kind of ceasefire and so on. If that's what Kerry meant by a political solution. That represents a major step forward by the United States. My guess is that he just meant more of the same boilerplate and some sort of magical idea that they will get Assad to step down without making him step down.
And finally, in Brazil, hundreds of thousands of people have been protesting in the streets of various cities, calling for President Dilma Rousseff to step down over allegations of corruption. A scandal concerning Brazil's national oil company, Petrobras, threatens to undo Rousseff's second term, to which he was elected only 5 months ago. An investigation absolved the president of any wrongdoing, but many members of the public are unconvinced. The demonstrations have been so massive that police estimate that 1 million people showed up in Sao Paulo alone on Sunday. Tens of thousands of protesters also showed up in Rio de Janeiro to express support for Rousseff. Rahul, what do you make of these protests? Is it really about corruption? And is Brazil's first female president in real trouble?
Well, there's a real corruption scandal, and Petrobras executives have basically engaged in behavior that has robbed the public exchequer of billions of dollars, and it seems fairly clear that that behavior has included, among other things, kickbacks to politicians, especially to PT members, the ruling party, or the ruling party in the coalition right now, and the party of Dilma Rousseff. So there is a real scandal. There's no question about it. It's a big one. It's a kind of thing that does bring down governments, not in the United States, apparently, where we can tolerate any amount of scandal. But in other countries, it does bring down governments. I would still note that, if you look at the protests, there's still a very overwhelming class basis to them. And, in Brazil, you can tell that by looking at the skin color of the protesters. It's still very much a sort of affluent middle class protest. If it spreads, then, yeah, she's in trouble.
Thank you, as always, Rahul, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now subscribe for direct access to all our shows online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. It's every parent's nightmare. Your child does not come home from school or never shows up at school. There's a search, maybe Amber Alerts, media coverage, and all too often a heartbreaking discovery. But the script for what happens when a child goes missing can be dramatically different depending on the race of the missing child. For years, academics, activists, and others have noted the disproportionate response from law enforcement, politicians, and the media when a white girl is missing compared especially to a black girl. But FBI data shows that a whopping 40% of missing people are black. So pervasive is the societal blind spot on missing children of color that it even has a name among academics: missing white girl syndrome. Activists have even formed national nonprofit organizations, one named Black and Missing But Not Forgotten, another called the Black and Missing Foundation. Now, a short feature film airing on HBO highlights the ordeal of a fictional African-American family when their 15-year-old daughter goes missing, and how they experience indifference from the police and the media. Muted is an award-winning film by Brandy Ford, Rachel Goldberg, and Tara Tomalchevich, which has been recognized at a number of film festivals and stars Lena Gladwell from Grey's Anatomy and my guest, Daniele Watts, whose film credits include Django Unchained, and appeared on Uprising last year after an altercation that she had with the police. Welcome to Uprising. Welcome back to Uprising, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me. It feels good. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, can you put this film, Muted, which I had the privilege of watching yesterday and just blew me away. I was just so impressed by it. How do you put this film into the larger social and political context of how missing children are treated in our society, depending on the color of their skin?
I feel like it's a ongoing conversation about how we can become more aware of the racism that exists in our society and how that fundamentally filters into all different areas of media, politics, government, law enforcement, and how that affects our perception as the media relays it to the public. And I think that's something that changes over time, but it's definitely becoming more clear and clear as people are taking to YouTube and making their own movies and getting that news out there, saying, look, we deserve to have our stories heard and recognized.
In many ways, this is sort of a very little talked about story in the news. I mean, as I mentioned, academics have been following this, noting the strong disparity in how people are treated in the media and law enforcement. And activists themselves in the African American community have formed organizations, have formed networks to try to do something to help themselves, because nobody seems to be giving enough help. But it's not covered very much in the media. And so I'm wondering, like, essentially the storyline of the film, a 15-year-old African-American girl who you play, Crystal, goes missing, doesn't show up home. And of course there's the predictable heartbreak. I think nobody except someone who's actually been through it really knows what it feels like as a parent to have your child not show up. And then police have a very different take. The sense is that, well, if it's a white child who goes missing, they're innocent, something bad must have happened to them, but if a black child goes missing, they're probably up to no good.
Yeah, well, it's hard to really speak to it unless you've been through it. You know, it's like one of those situations where, having been through, just speaking personally, being through a situation recently where I've notice the stereotypes that have been projected about me on a massive scale through the mainstream media, and then realizing that people relate to you completely differently because they totally believe that that is the truth. So, you know, people think, oh, well, she must be, you know, this sort of person who's having sex in her car just because a cop goes on TV and says that I was lying, even though the media doesn't cover the fact that the cop is currently under investigation and he's going to be fighting. There's so the balance.
Let's actually remind our listeners what happened last year. Yeah. Some of our viewers and listeners may remember from when we had you on our program last year. Essentially, you were detained temporarily, not formally arrested, by a police officer not too far away from where we're recording, and I understand that there was a perception that he assumed you were a sex worker. And you made a big stink about it instead of keeping quiet about it, which is perhaps what he might have expected you to do. And you Facebooked it, you spoke out about it, and then got slammed in the media for overreacting. But your experience, of course, is very similar to the sort of dehumanization that many black women and young girls get in our media.
Yeah, and so for me, speaking out about how I honestly felt, even though that may not have made me very popular with people, I think was what was important. And looking at how that relates to, for example, missing children, and speaking out about, look, you know, maybe my kid may not be perfect, but that doesn't mean that they're not as valuable as perhaps a white kid who goes missing. However, I think the media, the mainstream media, they look at numbers and they look at, you know, the perhaps white women who have the privilege of staying home, who don't have to work. That's their target audience. Those are the people that they're sort of gearing the news towards. So they're using fear, oh, if a white child goes missing, then we're going to pay attention to the news more because, you know, that's their target audience. Those are the people who are staying home to watch the news, while many minorities have to work and they have to, you know, be gone, so they're not maybe so much gearing the news towards
I think you're being kinder to the media than I would be. I think there's also the sense that black children are less innocent, and we should just come out and say that, right? There was a study done recently where police officers were shown photos of, in this case, boys, African-American boys, and they routinely and consistently overestimated the ages of black boys compared to white boys. And so there's this perception, this is part of our implicit bias that we hold. The Justice Department just did a study on Ferguson, Missouri, where they found just rampant implicit bias, well, rampant racial bias in both communications as well as arrest records of the police there, and that's part and parcel of it, right?
Yes, and I think speaking out about it is difficult because you don't want to be, waving the victim flag, but at the same time, there are real issues and real conversations, that radio stations like this, you guys have all the time, but the mainstream media, I think, on some level thinks that they're not digestible for the general public, but I think that's changing. I think with the internet and with, people being able to take their own stories and make them public, I think more and more people are saying, we don't need the mainstream news anymore to get our stories across. Let's get them across in our own way. And that's what I'm hoping for, with a film like this, which came from a film festival, won the prize at a film festival, and then got to be seen on HBO because it won the prize at the American Black Film Festival. So, these sort of channels that can help bring it to the mainstream in a way that people can digest and sort of feel into why somebody might be so upset, because a police officer or a media is relating to them a certain way, and kind of understand that emotional context a little bit more and feel it more deeply. So
let's talk a little bit more about the film. Actually, can you explain the title of the film, Muted?
Muted, yeah. It relates to, I think, the idea that this story, this feeling, this troubling problem is not being heard by society. So there's a deep frustration there. And then when the media finally pays attention in the film, they show up at the end of the film. She's distraught. Her child is gone. It's been weeks. There's nothing she can do at that point. And the media only picks it up when she's the angry black woman at that point. So then it then serves to reinforce this idea that black women are angry for no reason and, they're overreacting, when really it's a systematic sort of oppression of like what happens to a dream deferred that has to explode. So by the time the mainstream media catches on, the black people or the brown people or the minorities are angry, they're upset, when if we could catch on a little sooner and sort of feel into these stories when they're, as they're happening, then it doesn't reach this explosive point. But I think on many levels, we're already at that explosive point. So on some levels, we have to accept that anger is a part of that process. If you're going to be muted for such a long time, and the consequence for speaking up is that you get shamed on so many levels, then at a certain point the anger's got to come out, because that's part of the process of reconciliation and coming to clarity.
Well, the scenes that in the film, particularly of Lena Gladwell, who plays your mother in this film, Muted, the horror, the unimaginable anguish that a mother goes through. She'd had an argument with her child right before the child goes missing, as teenage girls and mothers do. Yeah. And just these solitary scenes where she's calling up members of the media, asking them to cover her missing daughter, were just really incredible. And can you also tell us about the scene where the family of the missing girl, who you play, sits up when the TV is turned on, and they think they're hearing the media covering the story of the missing girl? What happened?
Yeah, so they've been waiting, just on eggshells for some news, for some response, and they finally hear about a missing child on the news, and it turns out that it's actually a young white girl who has just gone missing.
Very similar circumstances.
Very similar circumstances. Last seen walking home from school, and there's sort of this incredulous response. You see it wash over their faces, going, wow, am I not human? Am I not valuable? And as you were saying, Chandra Wilson, from Grey's Anatomy, who plays Lena Gladwell, my mother, you can feel that in her emotions. She's so sort of trying to process and digest how she could be so easily dismissed. And you can feel almost like she might take it personally, like, is it something I did? Like, maybe I didn't pay enough attention, She starts to doubt herself as a mother. Maybe I wasn't a good mother. Maybe I didn't give my child enough. So there's this whole emotional conflict that she has to wade through based on stereotypes that are projected onto her as a mother, as a black mother, and it's complex, it's emotional and it's complex.
And thank you for that correction, Chandra Wilson. from Grey's Anatomy,
So
and the
good.
name of her character, Lena Gladwell, in this film, Muted. And it's interesting, I'm looking into this issue and that this film brings up. I'm also reminded of the story of the Grim Sleeper in this case in South Los Angeles of hundreds of missing, mostly young black women, and it took decades for the police and the media to catch on that there was this enormous tragedy that nobody was willing to do, enough about. Now there's a man on trial for the murders. There was this wonderful documentary about it recently called Tales of the Grim Sleeper. Many thought it might get an Oscar nod, but it didn't. And this sort of leads me to this question of that we were touching on earlier, how films like Muted have had to have a circuitous route to a platform like HBO. We recently saw the whitest Oscar ceremony that we've seen in many, many decades, launching a Twitter campaign, Oscars So White, hashtag Oscars So White. And I'm wondering, all of these things are part of the same problem, right? The dehumanization of young black girls and women in particular, media and police apathy, and also rejection from Hollywood, or just essentially, not a very welcome place for black-made films about black issues, etc.
Well, yes, and I feel like it's changing along with the tide of how people are digesting content. If anyone can take a camera in their hands and make a movie and project that to their friends and share it through the internet, then I feel like it devalues the Oscars. So yes, we're paying attention to them going, what's going on? What's going on? Why is there no diversity? At a certain point, people will just stop paying attention to these old and dying systems that dehumanize and devalue people, and we'll the whole system, I think, is crumbling and changing. The studio system is crumbling and changing, and along with it goes the Academy. I'm not daunted by those systems, otherwise I wouldn't be in Hollywood trying to be an actor. I mean, I'm still pushing on, creating work, doing projects like this that say, look, we don't need the approval of these old systems to get out there. We're going to do it anyway.
I'm also reminded of the social media campaign last year when celebrities all over the U.S., including First Lady Michelle Obama, rightly drew attention to the hundreds of missing Nigerian girls kidnapped by Boko Haram, and that was a huge story. Bring Back Our Girls was that campaign. But there are thousands of missing black women and girls here in the United States, literally tens of thousands. 40%, I mentioned, of the FBI's data suggesting that 40%, almost 40% of all missing people are African American. I mean, that's huge compared to the percentage of the population. No one's talking about that. I don't see the protests here from celebrities, even from Michelle Obama.
And that's why I'm here, because if I can lend my voice to it in a positive way, to say, look, it's not waving a victim flag, it's not angry for no reason, there is a real disparity here, and if we talk about it and share it, then this discussion starts to build to a resonance that people can actually digest it and realize that it's real. It's not just something that minorities are making up to wave the victim flag, because I think that's part of the shame that goes along with it. You think if you speak out about something, these families that are going through the hardest thing that you can possibly imagine, they think, oh, well, on some level I deserve this, because we're so conditioned by this dehumanizing idea of what it means to be black or brown in this country, in this society. And so through talking about it, we can release that shame and say, look, my life is just as valuable as anyone else's, and I'm going to speak up about it.
And I think this issue of humanity and humanizing is crucial here. We see on our TV screens and on the big screen how white people are constantly humanized. They feel, they hurt, they have complexity, they have nuance, and black characters and in general characters of color, but I think especially African American characters, you don't get that humanity. And in this film, Muted, it's so rare to just see the anguish of a black mother. And I'm wondering if you think that that's really the issue here that your film, you're hoping, will address, to humanize the pain a black mother goes through.
Exactly. I think that when you see her performance, it's undeniable. You can't help but feel what she's going through. And that's what the arts are all about, to sort of infuse this empathy into the public sphere, to be a mirror and say, yes, there's politics, there's government, but there's real humans within this structure that feel real things, and that's what creates, you know, sort of these ripples. I mean, if there wasn't a history of black people being considered less than human in this country, literally on the books, you know, that dehumanization wouldn't affect anyone's psyche in an emotional context. But it's literally laws written out on the books saying black people are less than human, and that has ripple effects that transpire in very complex ways. And if we can become aware of that through our emotions, then we can really feel it and make change, because we feel it. We're inspired to make change because of our feelings.
And there's never, of course, truly been a historical reckoning or reconciliation in this country, like there has at least attempted to have one in South Africa, for example, with apartheid there. We've never really had a formal reconciliation process. And I'm wondering if the Black Lives Matter movement that began last year and some of the conversations that digital technology is enabling us to have may at some point bring that up. And I'm also reminded of the actor David Oyelowo, who recently is playing Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, an incredible film that was snubbed by the Oscars, recently made a statement to the effect of, there's only certain kinds of roles that African Americans, when they play in movies, get recognized for. And I'm wondering, as an actress yourself, do you face a conundrum in terms of wanting to obviously get work and a limited set of roles that are available to you?
I think anyone that I've ever been inspired by as far as a pioneer or as far as an activist has said, you create what you want to see. And if you hold that vision so tightly, there's nothing that can stop you. And that's what I have to tell myself, because otherwise I would be frustrated all the time, depressed, and I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be in my room crying. You know, there's this optimism in me that says, you know, that if you want to make it, you're gonna make it. You're gonna find your voice, and you're gonna do everything you can to get that out there so that other people can see themselves reflected in your art. So that means complex stories where it's not just suffering and pain, but it's also light and it's also dark, and there's the characters aren't always perfect, where they're not always role models. You know, black and brown people are not all perfect, and I think that adds to the complexity. But we have all these stereotypes that are like mines that we're sort of wading through, you know, so it makes sense that so many of the black projects that are out there have to do with the representing proud images of what it means to be black. But I think that can also be an oppressive force too, because we're humans, so we're all things, you know, and
nobody is perfect.
Nobody's perfect, you know, and that's what I relate to deeply. You know, when the civil rights leaders denounced me and said, well, she's not a good representation of the black community, I really had to look inside and go, you know what? I am representing humanity, and so yes, I am black, but I'm representing this story of what the capability of what humanity can be, and people can either accept that or they can find another role model. Fine, you know. But for me, I'm going to do my best to bring the love that's in my heart and the passion and the clarity of my own experience to whatever that is, and that's messy and complicated, but ultimately, we're trying to, break down some of those walls of communication so that these understandings can come through in a deeper way, and I think film is a powerful tool to do that. And
right, and we should say so-called civil rights leaders, maybe. So finally, what are some of the projects that you're working on, and also, is it an exciting time to be in the film industry as a young African American, to have these avenues that 10, 20 years ago weren't available to people, to be able to, if a major studio snubs you, to enter it into a festival, get it on another platforms. There are some films that are being made for online audiences alone. There are TV shows being made for online audiences alone that are generating greater numbers than even traditional.
Well, that's the benefit of education, because I'm aware of the history. So that gives me such a deep appreciation for what we have now compared to what my dad had. It's just night and day. So I'm very appreciative of being here at this time. I have a film that's premiering at South by Southwest called The Babysitter, which is complex. It's about a white guy and a black girl, and she's older, and she's the family's babysitter, and it's messy. You know, it raises issues of this complexity of these people who aren't perfect, but it's being shown at a major festival, and it was made by my friend. You know, it's these avenues are breaking down, and I feel like if I put my focus there on all there is to appreciate about, you know, being able to express myself at this point in history compared to other points in history, it's all good, you know, because it's very inspiring to see that there are so many avenues to present your work, and that's a blessing that I just, you know, I can't help but feel thankful for.
And so finally, Muted, the film that we started this conversation around, showing, I believe, this month on HBO?
Yes, on HBO Go, and there are several showings in March. If you have HBO, you can look that up, and I know that they're planning to develop it into a full feature. Wow. So if you go to mutedthemovie.com, you can get more information about how you can support them, because I think a full feature would help to get the story out there in a broader way, you know, for people to really feel into this disparity with missing black girls and help bring that to light.
That's mutedthemovie.com, and my guest Daniele Watts plays the role of Crystal, a 15-year-old girl who goes missing. Chandra Wilson playing the role of her mother. She's, of course, famous from her role in Grey's Anatomy, and the film made by Brandy Ford, Rachel Goldberg, and Tara Tomelchevic. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I should say this is a women-run film. This is a women's project, too, which is also fantastic, and we need more women's films. This is Women's History Month. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you.
My guest, Daniele Watts, is an actress who stars in a short film called Muted, just released on HBO. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? We rely on subscribers to our YouTube channel to fund the TV production of Uprising, and you can sign up to be a subscriber at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. When President Obama earned the moniker Deporter-in-Chief, it was a sad moment for a Democratic administration that had promised to back the DREAM Act and uphold a more progressive policy toward undocumented people. If you listen only to the rabid anti-immigrant right wing of the Republican Party, Obama has offered up amnesty to foreign nationals. But in reality, he's deported more undocumented immigrants than any other president in U.S. history. Even though his government says it only prioritizes those people with criminal backgrounds, in reality, criminals represent a small fraction of people being deported. As families are separated, the stories of heartbreak are occurring alongside a resurgence of militant actions by people who've had enough and are risking deportation by engaging in civil disobedience. The stories of undocumented people, particularly youth, are detailed in a new book by Eileen Truax called Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for Their American Dream. Eileen Truax is originally from Mexico. She's a journalist and immigrant currently living in Los Angeles. She contributes regularly to Hoy Los Angeles and Unidos, and she writes for various Latin American publications, and she joins me in studio today. Welcome to Uprising, Eileen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, you open your book with a story about the food closet in UCLA, which I thought was an interesting way to open it, or place to open it. It's a student-created venture for other students to help them have access to food in an emergency, which many students are doing after, especially the recession hit them hard. But particularly undocumented students are relying on this because they are not eligible for financial aid. Their status makes them ineligible. Tell us about this food closet and why it was a sort of become a symbol for the dire straits that these young, undocumented people, the so-called dreamers, are in today.
Yes, I found this story and I thought that it was fascinating because it reflects very good what's going on right now with these young students that are trying to keep going to universities, going to colleges. They don't have a document, so they don't have the financial aid. They don't have the opportunity to do what you are supposed to do when you graduate from high school. And to find this space in a university like UCLA, one of the most renowned, the one that has the largest number of applications in the country, was very symbolic to me. What they're doing, there's this very small space. It was literally a closet that a group of students decided to use in order to put there some food, knowing that some of their fellow students didn't have the chance to eat sometimes during the day, since they don't have financial resources. So I think that illustrates very well what happens in the life of an undocumented students. For some of us, if we are just out there living our regular lives, it may not be an important or relevant story. What does an undocumented student to go to school? They get up, they go there, they study, and sometimes they graduate. But what's behind that?
Right.
The very fact that you have to decide what, at the moment you wake up in the morning and you have to make your first decision. I have to go to the school. Am I going to drive or I'm going to take the bus? If I'm driving, I'm going to get there on time, but I cannot drive because I don't have a driver's license. So I may go there, but they can stop me. They can
you risk,
give me
being
a
pulled
ticket
over.
or even deported.
Yeah.
So, but the other way, then I have to take the bus, then another bus, then it's late. Every decision you make during the day has something to do with your immigration status. At the moment you get to the school and you have to pay a full scholarship,
full tuition, right?
Full tuition.
Yeah. Because since undocumented immigrants are not eligible for in-state tuition, even though they've been living in the state they might be going to school in, they still have to pay the full tuition that an out-of-state student would have to pay, which is tens of thousands of dollars, up until recently.
Recently,
yes.
Some states like California give some aid to them, but yet you don't have another extra resources that you may need. Sometimes you need to work, sometimes at home situation is difficult. And the last thing you think about is, what am I going to eat today? So when I found this space, I found some food that people puts there just for people who needs that, and that may be any kind of people going through hard times.
Yeah, it's not just for undocumented students.
Of course not. It's not labeled that way. But there's a visitor's book, and people who uses the place and uses the food leave messages. And when I started reading the messages, I found out the messages were very moving, very touching, saying, I am a person with no documents and I wouldn't be able to eat today if it was not for this place. I've been living in my car. I have to eat $1 burritos for Taco Bell. The stories are very moving, and you realize that these are students helping other students because they understand what's going on, but you don't talk about it.
Right, and so that's also pointing to the sense of abandonment that these young dreamers have faced, that they live their lives, they graduate, and then higher education becomes very difficult. But if they manage that, then they graduate, then what? Getting a job is almost impossible. And they're stuck in a legal limbo, at least up until the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals programs that not everybody is eligible for necessarily. And so people started taking matters into their own hands more and more and more. Undocumented youth started risking deportation. And you profile a lot of these young folks, very brave individuals who have become very organized. One of them is a very interesting person named Muhammad Abdullahi, or Mo. I've had him on our program before. He's organized with the National Immigrant Youth Alliance and Dream Activist, where we covered their very bold border actions. And Mo is not a Mexican, American, or even Latin American. He's Iranian, undocumented himself. And he has a very interesting drive, a militant streak that has actually turned off some people. And you had a couple of interviews with him. Tell us about Mo and the direction in which he has pushed undocumented activism.
I think Mohammed and the whole group of Danièle, this organization, may symbolize the most radical, if you want to call it some way, area of this movement. When I started trying to write something about dreamers, the first obstacle that I found is that there's no one kind of dreamer. You cannot define, oh, dreamers are this way, or dreamers are like this. Or there's a very vast array of organizations, of ways to work. You have, at some point, these groups that are very by the book, that they go to Congress, they put a suit, and they talk to Congress members, they do lobby. They are, let's say, in a way, very well behaved. And then you have a lot of organizations, and you can end up in those that are doing civil disobedience, and that's what Danièle are doing. They decided that, okay, they tried to pass the DREAM Act legislation, and let's remember that the DREAM Act was introduced in 2001. So the piece of legislation has been there for a lot of time, 14 years now, has not passed. And at some point, then decided, the last time that there was a close chance to pass the legislation was in 2010. That time it passed in the House. It was 5 votes short in the Senate to
That
pass.
was the closest it ever came, yeah.
The closest it ever came, and at that moment, young people already had social media. They were very well connected to the country. They were very well organized, and they decided, okay, if we're not going to have this, we have 2 options. We can wait till 2012, next election, or maybe a few more years, or we can start doing something by ourselves. So they decided to take the matter into their hands, and they start doing these actions just to push to put the issue out there, to let people know their stories, their situation. And when you block a street and they're going to arrest you, and that arrest may mean that you're going to be deported, and you still do it, you're sending a very strong message.
Right.
I have nothing else to lose.
Right.
So please take a look at me.
Yeah.
Listen to me, because no one else is doing it.
And these folks are doing this in the tradition of the United States.
Of
This
course.
is a long U.S. Tradition that goes back to the Civil Rights Movement, which took its cue from the anti-imperialist actions in India under Gandhi. They're very, very strong actions, and they have sort of, what effect have they had? Because you document one of the early actions in Alabama, a state with some of the harshest anti-immigrant rules, and I loved how you profiled the meetings, that training meetings that these young folks went to. They were so prepared. They knew down to the second what their choreographed actions would be, how to talk to all this training for how to talk to the press, how to get arrested, how to interact with the police. They were extremely organized.
Yes, I love one of the quotes from Maud when he says, "If we are lucky, by 5 p.m. we're going to be arrested." So
we're lucky.
They were looking for that because they know that's the way to put the message out. Definitely, I think this is part of a long change of civil disobedience, of the civil rights fight in the U.S. And when you ask me if this has worked or if they got something out of this, you just mentioned Daca. And although it's not by far a good solution for this, because Daca is only they only give this action only gives them a work permit
And a temporary
it's
status,
temporary.
yeah.
It doesn't give residency, not a path to citizenship. It only lasts for 2 years. Now it's renewed for other 2 years, but still makes this population vulnerable. It's not a recognition of their civil rights in a full way. But We have Daca, and I think that's a direct response to the movement that this one and other organizations has done. I think in the recent years, the Dreamers have become the most kind face of the whole pro-immigrant movement.
And Daca is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that President Obama unveiled. He recently had another program, Deferred Action for Parental Accountability, DAPA, which has now been held up legally. Let's talk about another figure that you profile in your book, Dreamers, and that's that is a person who no longer lives in the United States, which is really interesting because most of everybody else that you profiled were dreamers in the U.S. But then you followed the story of a young woman who was deported, and we hear about these statistics of people who've been deported, and unless you personally know somebody who's been deported, it's really hard to personalize it, to humanize it. Tell us about Nancy Landa, who she is and where you met her first.
I think Nancy
And actually,
Landa,
can you read for our listeners and our viewers a section from your book about her?
Sure. You want me to start with the reading?
Sure.
And then
Just so we can set the stage for the story of Nancy Landa.
Okay. Okay, the chapter 4 is named Back to a Strange World. And on a Tuesday morning, just like any other, Nancy Landa got herself ready for work. Full-figured, with dark hair, olive skin, and a bright smile, she put on black pants, a blouse, and low-heeled pumps for her job at the government office in California. It was 2009, and at 29, Nancy was the very picture of success. She had graduated 5 years before with a degree in business administration from California State University, Northridge, and since then, she had doggedly climbed up the professional ladder, first in community service organizations and then in the public sector. Nancy made sure she had everything she needed for the day in her handbag, her wallet with $40 on it, credit and debit cards just in case, and her ever-present cell phone. She left the apartment she shared with her brother in Long Beach in Los Angeles County with plenty of time to get to the office. She got in her car, which she had bought just a few months earlier and was still paying off, and headed to the freeway. While she was driving down 3rd Street, a white van ordered her to pull over. It wasn't a Long Beach police or highway patrol vehicle, but Nancy wasn't worried. She pulled over to the side of the street, rolled her window down, and waited for the officer to perhaps cite her for some minor infraction or alert her to something about her car that needed attention. Then her nightmare began. 3 people stepped up to Nancy's cars and informed her she was being detained. One of them, a woman, announced they were immigration agents. "You know why we are detaining you, right? Were you hiding from us?" said another. And they took her back and escorted her into their vehicle, a van with no identifying markings. Her car stayed right where it was, parked on the side of the road. 2 hours later, Nancy found herself in a detention center in downtown Los Angeles, and just 8 hours later, she was deported to Tijuana, Mexico, with only the clothes on her back. She had no friends or family there, no past. All she had was the handbag they had returned to her once she was on the other side of the border, with the $40, credit cards, and cell phone. And just like that, on an ordinary Tuesday that had begun like any other, the life Nancy Landa built for herself over the past 20 years was gone.
Eileen Truax reading from her book Dreamers, An Immigrant Generation's Fight for Their American Dream. So Nancy Landa, 20 years living in the United States. She's working, she's a young person, she has her car, and within hours she's picked up and tossed into Tijuana, where she barely has any familiarity with this situation, with the place she's in. And she represents an interesting case because people often say, if you want legalization, go to the back of the line and get in line and legalize. But Nancy Landa's family did just that. They tried to get her papers, right?
They did that. They came when Nancy was 9. She barely remembers her life in Mexico. And when they were here, they went to a notary. These people that sometimes tries or offers immigrants to help them with their documents, but they're no lawyers. So what they offered to the family was to apply for asylum. And, you know, when you apply for asylum and you present your case, they take a while to decide, and meanwhile, you have your documents to stay legally in the country, because we have a huge backlog in the immigration courts. This may take 4, 5, 6 years until they solve your case about asylum. But once they solve, if the response is no, you have to go back to your country.
Right, and then you're in the system, and then they track you down and say you have to leave.
They track you down. So, but the thing is this, years came by and the notary was out of sight of the family, so they didn't even know that the case was denied. They didn't even know that they had a deportation order. And of course, not of any of this information was not in the mind of Nancy, because their parents wanted to do something good for the children, but they didn't share all the information. They were just happy that they had documents so they could go to school, they could buy a car, they could do their lives. And this is very interesting. Let's think that many of these dreamers came to the country at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6 years, 9 years. You are not really aware about your situation. You just
you think you're just an American kid, yeah.
You think as an American kid, you think you are actually an American kid. You just don't have the documents that say that. So to be back in a country that is not really your country, where you have nothing. And
she actually had the added advantage that others don't, in the fact that she had technical skills. She had some savings in her bank account in the U.S. She had a cell phone that worked, and she had family and friends who immediately drove to Tijuana, helped her find a place to stay the night. Her family also deported. But how do others who don't have the privilege of those skills and those bank savings survive?
It is terrible.
I mean, is there sort of a mini population now in areas like Tijuana of people who speak, you know, American English because they spent so many years here and were deported but don't really fit in any place, a sort of no man's land?
There's a very interesting project right now in Mexico. The name is Los Otros Dreamers, in Spanish, The Other Dreamers. This is led by Jill Anderson. She is an academic from Texas. She went to Mexico for a postdoc program, and then she found out that there was this population of young American people working in call centers in Mexico City. She started tracking them, and her estimate is that maybe about 500,000 deported or returned dreamers in Mexico.
500,000?
500,000. That's the estimate about Jill in the last 10 years. Let's think about this. President Obama, during 6 years, has deported 400,000 people to several countries, but most of them are from Mexico and other countries of Latin America, but mainly Mexico. So 500,000 in 10 years kind of makes sense.
Right?
Many of them are in their 20s.
So they're working in a call center for what, American companies?
Yeah, of course.
Speaking English.
Speaking English.
Earning probably half the wage they would do in call centers in the United States. So the U.S. is happy, U.S. companies are happy to hire them on the other side of the border.
It's very likely that some of us have talked to them whenever we call to our cable service, our phone service, just to complain for someone. They're talking to us. That's the only way they can get a job in Mexico, because, as you can imagine, if you go there, you have no background, you don't speak the language, you know no one.
Your credentials, your academic credentials don't necessarily transfer.
They don't help you, so that's the only option that you have. But most important of all, even if you get a job, even if you start a life, you do not belong there. Your family is here. Your friends are here. Sometimes your property is here. Nancy left a car in the middle of the street, and she doesn't have an idea what happened to it. So you have a life here. The American society knows that you have a life because you have been part of it. The country knows that you have a life here. And suddenly, everything's gone.
Now, in addition to the stories of people like Nancy Landa, Muhammad Abdullahi, you do share with us the stories of some of the politicians, the very tiny handful of stalwart politicians who have done their best to try to push for the DREAM Act. One such person is Senator Dick Durbin, who has raised awareness in Congress year after year about immigrant youth, undocumented youth. What motivates him? What are some of the things he does in Congress?
But for me, it was very touching to find out what he was doing. Every certain time, what Senator Durbin does is he prints out in a very large scale the picture of one of the dreamers. So he goes up in the Congress to talk to his fellow colleagues there, and he starts telling the story of the person whose picture he has in there. He has been telling the stories of dreamers for a very long time, just trying to convince other senators that these are people, these are stories. When we talk, and that's a huge problem here, we have politicized the issue of immigration. We speak about 11.5 million people, 2 million dreamers. We are all about numbers, and we forget about stories.
Yeah.
I think what Senator Durbin has done is to put a face and a name on every one of these youth, and he is telling, just take a look around, because they're sitting next to your children in their schools.
Yeah.
They're your neighbors. They're here.
And you also tell us a story of current LA City Councilman Gil Cedillo, the role that he's played in doing things like helping to pass the driver's licenses bill for immigrants, undocumented immigrants, which did pass in California. In the last couple of minutes we have left, you've got a whole chapter in your book called Undocu-Queers, which is something we rarely hear about. Tell us about this group of undocumented youth who are also part of the LGBT community and might face sort of a double the oppression.
Yes. When I was doing all the research, I found out that some of these youth were actually organized, creating a subgroup inside the movement, and they started calling it Undocu-Queers. They youth that had been living, one of them told me, in a double closet. They have to hide their sexual orientation, and they have to hide their immigration status. And to live in that way, in a double shadow during the most vulnerable years of your life, it can be a burden. But to be part of the movement has given them some strength, some identity, and the courage to say, okay, if at some point I'm going to go out of the gay closet and say, I am gay, I have the strength to do it also with my immigration status, and the other way around. Some of them started with the pro-immigrant movement, and they realized that they were strong and they had a network to support them to fully be what they wanted to be.
Well, I want to thank you, Eileen, so much for joining us. Much more to talk about, but I'm sure our audience can pick up a copy of your book and check it out and learn all of the stories that you write about. Thanks so much, and best of luck to you.
I hope. Thank you so much.
My guest, Eileen Truax, is the author of the book Dreamers and Immigrant Generations Fight for Their American Dream. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Corinne Gaston is our research intern. And Joseph Stone is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Golhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.